Hi everyone. My name is Nasser Rabbat. I'm here to just welcome you to our Arhan lecture, which is now the third event this semester in our An Evening with Lecture series. Our speaker today is Peter Christensen, and he is going to be introduced by Brittany Ellis, our PhD student here. But before that, I'm just going to say a few words. Before reading the land acknowledgement, which has become some sort of a tradition in here, and which actually does not acquire its full meaning until it is activated or it's rooted in some sort of a true commitment in the present, I want to start by asking you all for a moment of silence in mourning for all the innocent lives which were lost and will continue to be lost in Palestine and Israel if the world does not impose a cessation of hostility. So, a few moments of silence. Thank you. I'll go now through the ritualistic reading of our acknowledgement. MIT acknowledges indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which MIT sits is the traditional unceded territory of the Wapanong Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected to this land and to any other land from time immemorial. I will now invite Brittany Ellis, our PhD student, to introduce our guest speaker, Peter Christensen.
Thank you, Nasser. We're fortunate to be joined this evening by Peter Christensen, who is the Arthur Satz Professor of the Humanities and the Annie and Mark Gabrellian Director of the Humanities Center at the University of Rochester. A prolific scholar, Professor Christensen's interests are wide-ranging, exploring Europe's entanglements with the world in the 19th and 20th centuries, the relationship between architecture and industry and infrastructure, materiality and building, and as well as addressing such topics as the digital humanities. He is the author of Germany and the Ottoman Railways, Art, Empire, and Infrastructure from the Yale University Press 2017, winner of the 2020 Alice Davis Hitchcock Award from the Society for Architectural Historians for the most distinguished work of scholarship in the history of the built environment by a North American scholar. He is also the author of Precious Metal, German Steel, Modernity and Ecology, from Penn State Press 2022, and the forthcoming book, Prior Art, Patents and the Nature of Invention in Architecture, out of MIT Press, due in 2024. He has edited such volumes as Buffalo at the Crossroads, The Past, Present, and Future of American Urbanism, Cornell University Press 2020, as well as Expertise and Architecture in the Modern Islamic World, a Critical Anthology, Intellect in University of Exeter Press. And the divergent themes of these two volumes, I think, alone speak to his expertise across the field of architectural history. Additionally, he has penned scores of articles, chapters, reviews, and catalog entries. Professor Christensen has received fellowships from the John Solomon Guggenheim Foundation, the Institute for Advanced Study, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Fulbright Commission, the Paul Mellon Centre for British Art, the Gerda Henkel Stiftung, the New York State Council for the Arts, and the Forum Transregionale Studien, among others. Tonight's lecture, entitled Dignity Matters, promises to be a rich consideration of the concept of dignity and the ways it informs architecture and design. So without further ado, please help me welcome Professor
Christensen. Thank you, Brittany, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Nasser, for the pre-introduction as well. And thank you all for coming. It is really a delight to be back somewhere where I know my way around and to be among friends and mentors. And I want to thank you all by a little way of disclaimer for your willingness to think with me tonight through this very fresh project that I only began a year ago, and this is in fact my very first public presentation of it. I try not to give this caveat before talks, but it really feels iterative, and so I really am looking forward to the Q&A. Okay, so in his widely cited collection of essays on morality from 1779, the lecture on ethics, Immanuel Kant issued an aphorism on the nature of human dignity. Every man is to be respected as an absolute end in himself, and it is a crime against the dignity that belongs to him as a human being to use him as a mere means for some external purpose. Kant was advancing a growing body of Western philosophy on human rights, moving one step beyond the material rights of air, food, and shelter to say that every human being not only has the innate right to live, but the right to live a life free from instrumentalization towards an end. In other words, every life has intrinsic value. This sentiment began to gain global currency, paving the way for reform movements in the 19th and 20th century that actually acknowledged this precept. And so before the modern period, dignity was a word utilized to connote the state of being worthy of honor and respect, but was largely conceived as a quality that was either hereditary or earned. So at worst, one possessed it by virtue of being born into nobility, and at best, it came from some measure of accomplishment, whether it was military, intellectual, or athletic. Kantian dignity upended this anti-universal dignity, and in its stead put forth the tenet that, at least in theory, all human life, irrespective of class or achievement or race or gender, deserves dignity. So this radical shift to a universal dignity may explain why our thinking about dignity over the last 2 centuries has been primarily philosophical and not material in nature. By the 20th century, dignity became so widely entrenched in humanist philosophy that we see it also transfigure into a legal concept in the constitutions of modern nation-states. Mexico's 1917 Constitution enshrined dignity as a concept that justified providing everyone with a free public education. Weimar Germany linked dignity to a decent standard of living in its 1919 Constitution. Latvia's 1922 Constitution enshrined dignity as the legal bulwark against state-sanctioned torture. Ecuador generalized, and as Ana Maria told me before the talk, we're not sure if this actually exists in reality, but at least in theory, they generalized dignity in its constitution in 1929, noting that the state had the duty to ensure the dignity of the laborer and the farmer. But most famously, dignity is the central precept of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. However, as with the philosophy of the 18th and 19th centuries, legal enshrinement in the 20th century did not mean that the preservation of human dignity was a fact on the ground. So world wars, everyday hatred, and poverty have stripped millions of their dignity when it did not strip them of their lives. Moreover, while poverty, the most pernicious eroder of dignity, has decreased, inequality has detonated, and gross inequality manifests its own indignities. Today, the world faces new challenge to the preservation of human dignity, and above and beyond all of these threats is the specter of a climate catastrophe that threatens our ability to ensure the dignity of future generations. So all of these existential challenges to human dignity merit a major thought experiment, one where we return to the material condition of dignity, back to the issues of air, food, water, and shelter, and marry that with the philosophy of dignity that we have accrued since Kant. So let's start that thought experiment today. I'd like everyone to conjure in your mind's eye an image of what dignity actually looks like physically. So you might conjure up an image of a person in a space that meets all of their basic needs. The space might hint at a life of peace and contentment. So you'll have walls and a roof, natural light and fresh air, doors and windows for connecting with and retreating from the world. There will likely be objects that point to a life of sufficiency, food, medicine, clean water, and others that point to a life with social and intellectual horizons. In all likelihood, this image includes little excess. So to be sure, dignity is not manifest by creature comforts alone. it is also borne out in the right to work, the right to have a family, and the right to have access to health care and education, along with the ability to live in peace and experience happiness and all of the other emotions that give life intrinsic meaning. Unlike a standard of living or wealth, however, dignity does not grow ad infinitum. Rather, it exists in a sweet spot somewhere between poverty and excess. So my interest in this material nature of dignity is also purpose-oriented. Amid the myriad catastrophes that we and our built world now face because of the climate crisis, it has become clear that the global north must curb its levels of material consumption. And this is a map showing you a proportional rate of carbon emissions. So it's a particularly gross injustice that the carbon emissions unleashed on the world by the industrial global north are the same emissions that will radically alter the lives of the global south. Climate change and the migrations and demographic changes it has already set into motion make it clear that radical alterations to our material world are urgent. And this is where dignity comes into the picture. So I offer you today the concept of dignity as the most emancipatory tool we have at our disposal for understanding how to balance the fallout of the climate change that we are all seeing, while maintaining a commitment to a threshold condition of human dignity. So the climate crisis and the anthropocentric changes it demands raises the specter of a future world full of architectural sacrifices. Sacrifices of creature comforts like climate-controlled spaces, excessive space in homes, the further densification of our towns and cities, and so on. After all, the building sector presently accounts for 40% of global carbon emissions. The radical changes that are needed raise a question. How, as we develop new ways of living, can the concept of dignity guide us to a way of life that demonstrates both the value of a human life and the value of our environment? It does not have to be a zero-sum game. So let's not kid ourselves, though. We cannot know what the future will be, and I am definitely not going to join a chorus of future casters. I kind of hate that niche of thinking. Instead, I present a radical proposal that the past already inhabits our future, and that the historian has a special role in the signposting of dignity in our built world. So since the dawn of the Enlightenment, dignity has been a through line of progressive architecture. For the first time in history, dignified housing for the poor and the working class became crucial social questions. The world came into its greatest equilibrium yet, where a sizable portion of the population lived in what we would recognize as a dignified condition. The nobleman Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's 1486 oration on the dignity of man, often called the Manifesto of the Renaissance, remains a touchstone in thought on the subject of dignity. My interpretation of Mirandola's text eschews the common refrain that it was a love letter to the liberal arts, and instead argues that it was a deeply subversive tract aiming to confer innate worth on all peoples. Kant furthered this argument during the Enlightenment, as I've said. But there was, however, a certain irony in the Enlightenment's championing of secular human dignity, in that it often seemed as if no one was reading the proverbial memo. Internationalization and globalization are largely to blame. The transatlantic slave trade, colonial subjugation, and economic exploitation manifested indignities on a scale and with a cruel efficiency the world had never seen. The Industrial Revolution and the exponential growth of cities also detonated several intense indignities on the urban and working poor. Pollution, unsafe and unethical labor practices, and the squalid living conditions of those documented by people like Jacob Riis, a fellow Dane, to continue that theme tonight, is evident in his touchstone 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives. So the rest of my talk today will look at three architectural projects tethered to this rhetoric of dignity, either by way of its architect, its client, its historiographers, or some combination thereof, assessing the ways in which history informs our understanding of dignity as a threshold condition for architecture. So these three projects include Worpswede in Lower Saxony, New Gurna in Upper Egypt, and the projects of Rural Studio in Hale County, Alabama. Okay, so let us begin in Lower Saxony. Sure, how do I do that? Maybe I'll let someone else do that while I keep going.
You know how to do it?
Okay. So the hamlet of Worpswede is located in northern Lower Saxony in the heart of the so-called Teufelsmoor, a region of bog and moorland northeast of the city of Bremen. First settled in the 18th century as part of the Holy Roman Empire and later succeeded to the Kingdom of Hanover, followed by Prussia, the hamlet was part of a scheme of what the historian David Blackburn has called Prussian internal colonization in the 1870s. This involved a large population resettlement scheme of agricultural laborers from East Prussia, or what is today Poland, as well as Swabia and Lithuania, to West Prussia in order to increase the population of agricultural areas in the Reich. In the decades that followed, the Teufelsmoor region emerged as one of the most unique resettlement experiments in Europe, boasting a bohemian, multi-ethnic, and agrarian identity geographically close, but a world away from the industrial engine of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, and its perimeter, just to the south. So these are some of the reasons that Teufelsmoor attracted in 1884 the artist Fritz Mackensen, a young painter and key figure of the so-called Dusseldorf School, a group of painters interested in realist history and landscape painting. Mackensen, like many of his ilk in the Dusseldorf School, lamented Germany's feverish industrialization and relocated to Worpswede to immerse himself in a pastoral agricultural landscape with the vast uninterrupted vistas that the flatness of the landscape offered. Soon arriving in Worpswede, Mackensen recruited a number of other painters, sculptors, and artists to live there too. And these are some of the more prominent cast of characters that they include, and you can read their names. I won't read them myself. So with regard to dignity, there is much to glean from the visual output of the various artists at Worpswede, all of whom place a strong emphasis on communing with nature and living interdependently. So I don't have time to focus on all of them individually, but we find in their works strong commitments to self-sufficiency and a rejection of urban capitalism suffused with the notion of Würde, or dignity. In fact, Würde appears in the colony's charter as a central precept of its purpose. But it's through the poetry of Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, seen here in the second from the left at the top, that the concept of dignity is most expressly articulated. So Rilke, the Austrian poet known for his quasi-mystical work, wrote much of the most important poetry of his most important poetry in Worpswede, including a great deal of the poems that would appear in two separate canonical collections called the Book of Images in 1902 and the Book of Hours in 1905. Scholars have long identified Rilke's poetry from his time in Worpswede as a spiritual encapsulation of the colony's ethos of agrarian communitarianism and its artistic representation of the dignity of the human spirit. So it was in the Book of Images that Rilke crystallized his use of metaphors, metonymy, and contradictions to convey the leitmotif of disbelief. Disbelief that most often was deployed to characterize a disjuncture between religious faith and earthly realities, a testament to the larger erosion of religion that was occurring after the imperial consolidation in Germany in 1871. Rilke, who like Mackensen had become disenchanted by the city and its harsh industrial conditions at the hands of strident capitalism, wrote of a return to the countryside and a kind of spirituality in things contradistinctive to religious doctrine. This sentiment is most aptly articulated in his letters to a young poet, and I'll quote here. "If there is nothing you can share with other people, try to be close to things. They will not abandon you. And the nights are still there, and the winds that move through the trees and across many lands. Everything in the world of things and animals is still filled with happening, which you can take part in. And children are still the way you were as a child, sad and happy in just the same way. And if you think of your childhood, you once again live among them, among the solitary children, and the grown-ups are nothing, and their dignity has no value." End quote. So Rilke, in traditional contradictory fashion, is herein ascribing dignity, or Würde, to adults and not to children. This echoes and even though he says it means nothing, this echoes the thinking at the same time that dignity, while available to all, was something that one comes into by virtue of their deeds and their responsibilities, indicative as this is of the religious piety nested in popular morality. The child, by contrast, could not have dignity because she had not yet had the chance to prove her worthiness of it through deeds and actions. But just as soon as Rilke asserts the idea of dignity as something that is earned, he deems it a quality of no value. So this stands in contrast with the child, who, like the animal, experiences the world of things in nature especially, with an intrinsic sense of curiosity and wonder, and the full range of human emotions. The acquired dignity of the adult is valueless because it is contained and cannot be shared the way the world of things can be. Rilke is in turn suggesting that dignity may, in fact, not be acquired over the course of a life, but rather gradually lost as one ages, and becomes increasingly dissociated from the world of things, both natural and man-made, and instead inculcated into the world of immaterial preoccupations, labor, capital, politics. Children, as such, represent a kind of paramount dignity in their immaterial preoccupations, those of curiosity and wonder, a kind of dignity Rilke seeks reignited in the colony at Worpswede. So Rilke's most well-known colleagues at Worpswede were mostly visual artists, but there were also designers who, like him, sought to assert this esoteric idea of dignity in their creative output. One example is Edwin Koneman. Koneman was a writer and disciple of the architect Bruno Taut. Koneman emulated a number of Taut's quasi-phantasmagorical designs from his 1917 Alpine architecture series and his well-known glass pavilion from the 1914 Cologne Werkbund exhibition to come up with a design for his own house, which came to be known as the Käseglocke, or the cheese bell, in 1926. Koneman came to Worpswede as a young man in 1908 with the aim of becoming an artist. He befriended the architect Franz Hebich, who gave him an edition of Taut's Frühlicht, which was published in 1921. And in the magazine, Koneman came across the plans for a Taut-designed one-family house, which was never realized. The main idea for the house, which was shaped like an igloo, is for one to reside cozily and to feel protected. Koneman was attracted to the modest scale of the igloo and the ability at its center to be surrounded by all of one's things, as if to assert dominion and embody the dignity described by Rilke. And I talk about things here in relation to the previous quote as well. So Koneman was attracted to Taut's conception of architecture as an art devised from nature without any applied academic rules, something you see in much of the house's fittings that Koneman designed. The chimney of the igloo forms the main axis. Here's more photos of the interior. The chimney forms the main axis around which stairs wind up to individual chambers, similar in appearance to a snail shell. The central hall, which was arranged with an expressionistic mantelpiece composed from misfired pottery, became the principal position, while the living room was the central room in Taut's design. Koneman was also the chronicler and the first major sort of champion of Worpswede, and a pretty public figure. What he lacked in the critical success of his own writing, he made up for in his reputation as the enthusiast in chief of the colony. He writes of the beauty and dignity of life at the colony in his own house, where he speaks of being eingekapselt, or encapsulated, in his Taut-inspired igloo, with all of the things, again, think Rilke, and warmth his soul needs to feel fulfilled. Okay, so at this point I could be leading you to believe that dignity is the stuff of a kind of bourgeois artistic utopianism, and it is not. Although the utopian project is an important site for the negotiation of human dignity, it is by no means limited to it. Any discussion of utopianism in the 20th century necessarily involves mass housing, and any discussion of mass housing, in some measure, informed by dignity theory, whether or not the architect realizes it. So, with this, I turn now to the village of New Gurna in Upper Egypt. So New Gurna, which is seen here in my own photographs, was a settlement commissioned by the Egyptian Department of Antiquities in 1945. The goal was to relocate the residents of Old Gurna, a sort of long-standing improvised settlement, so as to repristinate the pharaonic sites adjacent to it, which includes Hatshepsut's temple, the Valley of the Queens, and the Valley of the Kings, among other sites. In so doing, the sites would become primed for greater touristic development. And this was really a sort of big part of Egypt's plan to bring more tourists to Upper Egypt, and it later also was sort of buttressed by the construction of the Aswan Dam. So depending on what you're reading, the residents of Old Gurna are alternately described as looters or amateur archaeologists. So regardless of what they're called, though, the settlement was in fact home to antiquities traders since at least the 19th century, who made a living digging in the numerous valley tombs for treasure, most of which reached international buyers looking to develop Egyptological collections in the West. As this audience certainly knows, the architect of New Gurna was Hassan Fatih, an Egyptian-born, Egyptian-trained architect selected as the architect of the new village, who was in turn tasked with not only constructing new homes for the residents of Old Gurna, but also redesigning the entire social and economic infrastructure of their livelihood. In his plan, Fatih sought to retool the careers of Old Gurna's residents from that of amateur archaeologists to that of craftsmen, who would make touristically oriented handicrafts, trinkets, and souvenirs out of alabaster, onyx, and other local stones. New Gurna contained workshops for these activities, as well as a market from which to sell them. The settlement also included communal structures that Fatih saw as necessary for a village of several hundred, so a mosque, a school, even an open-air theater. Political and financial complications, as well as the residents' opposition to the relocation, wind up preventing completion, though. So today, only about 30% of what was completed of the original village remains. And here are some of my own photographs from what does remain. So New Gurna's architecture consisted of modest, user-built mud brick structures, chosen for their simplicity and affordability. In addition, they could be constructed with local materials without having to rely on international resources for the most part. His designs pulled from a variety of historical Egyptian sources, most prominently Coptic and Nubian architecture, even though many argued that the Nubian architecture was not relevant to this population. So with these, he creates his own vernacular style. But we must be clear here, so that as original as the design is, Gurna was pretty much widely agreed a kind of massive failure. So for instance, Fatih made courtyards an essential part of the residence. And however, courtyards were rarely used in this region of Egypt. And when they were really had a more practical function as a work area, not a space for the leisure and enjoyment that he was designing for. So the most rudimentary secondary literature on Fatih will paint him as a kind of benevolent utopian seeking to better the lives of his countrymen. More sophisticated analyses, and these are some images of the abandoned settlements, and his own archive paint a more complex picture. One of an architect intent, to be sure, on improving the lives of the poor through good architecture, but also of a man with a deep-seated suspicion of the rural poor, who in his mind lack dignity through a combination of their living conditions, which is something they largely can't control because of their poverty, and something, but also something that they can control, what he describes as their, quote, peasantly insolence, end quote. So Fatih has left behind an extensive written record, so he's a great architect to work with because there's so much writing, including his book on New Gurna, which was eventually titled Architecture for the Poor, an experiment in rural Egypt, but first published as Gurna, A Tale of Two Villages, by the Egyptian Ministry of Culture in 1969. So his archives at the American University of Cairo reveal even more discussions of the term dignity in correspondence, manuscript drafts, and his own literature collection. So one of the key measures of dignity was the de-standardization of mass housing. Fatih writes the following, quote, "How can people so poor that they cannot even afford to buy ready-baked bread but have to make their own to save the baker's profit, even dream of a factory-made house. To talk of prefabrication to people living in such poverty is worse than stupid. It is a cruel mockery of their condition. We cannot house them cheaply even when we do standardize, and we cannot house them with any semblance of human dignity unless we destandardize, which is said to be expensive." End quote. So destandardization was one pillar of imparting dignity for Fati. Another was the environmental quality of the home. In discussing the design of bedrooms in the development, Fati has the following to say about dignity. The room is to be used in the following way. The vaulted alcove or iwan would contain a built-in bed with room for keeping things underneath it. Opposite the bed alcove is another small vault over a cupboard, a neat replacement for the usual rope on which the peasant hangs his clothes and other effects. The central area would thus be kept clear of furniture and give a sense of space and dignity to the room. This would be a great improvement on the usual peasant room, with its small, dark, ill-ventilated place. End quote. So here we sense the peculiar tension of Fati's persona, at once decrying the standardization of modern architecture and its love affair with prefabrication. It was great timing for Larry Sass to enter the room, while also championing the minimization and streamlining of furnishings and bric-a-brac, a well-known aphorism of modernism. So a third pillar of dignity for Fati lies within the activation of a kind of autodidacticism in his clients. And he says the following: "The maturing of skill is an experience of considerable spiritual value to the craftsman. And a man who acquires the solid mastery of any skill grows too in self-respect and moral stature. In fact, the transformation brought about in the personalities of the peasants when they build their own village is of greater value than the transformation in their material condition. Each craftsman individually gains in understanding and dignity, while the village collectively acquires a sense of society, of interdependence and brotherhood that only such cooperative achievement can give." End quote. So most tellingly, Fati describes New Gurna holistically as not an end in itself, but rather as a heuristic for a better architecture writ large. This description of New Gurna as non-instrumental is precisely the kind of language that defines Kantian conceptions of dignity, in which the individual is never a means to an end. What seems to be occurring in Fati's articulation here is effectively a transposition of human dignity onto architecture. So when imbued with dignity, architecture and man retain intrinsic spiritual value even when they point towards universal ideas. So this explains perfectly why destandardization and kind of the value of individuality was such a profound concern for Fati. So however inventive and beautiful, we cannot ignore the failure of New Gurna to deliver on Fati's tall ambitions to alleviate poverty and retrain the amateur archaeologists of Luxor. The residents, by and large, did not become as enamored with New Gurna as critical regionalists and architecture critics did. They were unwilling or unable to participate in the rather stringent investment needed for the upkeep of mud brick structures, and they were generally loath to jump in wholesale to the more dignified business of artisans, although one can go and still have no issue finding alabaster workshops run by the descendants of the tomb raiders. I even bought some trinkets myself from men who boasted this heritage. They were extremely proud of it. So at the root of this, I suspect, is a peculiar collision of values, where on the one hand the state wishes to make honest men of tomb raiders, and on the other, the tomb raiders had themselves been part of a lineage of generations of tradespeople with a certain measure of pride, or dignity even, that conflicts with the Western museological morality being imposed on them from the architect. So this work, however problematic, was the livelihood they knew, and it would not surprise me if their reluctance to be domesticated into dignified citizens was in fact something that was seen as itself a profound assault on their dignity. So if architecture was the primary and to some degree only tool for this domestication, it is not a surprise that they were indignant, which could, under the facile interpretation of the elite, be seen as ingratitude and not the more complicated thing that it actually was. Okay, so Hassan Fatih's work in New Gurna shares affinities with the work of Rural Studio, both focused on thoughtful design as a solution to the housing needs of the indigent and marginalized. Rural Studio is a satellite campus of Auburn University School of Architecture and is located in New Bern, Alabama, in Hale County, one of the poorest counties in the United States, and at the heart of the so-called Black Belt of the U.S. South. The term Black Belt originally referred to the region's rich black soil, and the term takes on additional meaning in the 19th century when the region was developed for cotton plantation agriculture because of this very soil, and in which the workers were enslaved African Americans. So after the American Civil War, many freedmen stayed in the area as sharecroppers and tenant farmers, continuing to comprise a majority of the population in many areas of these counties today. Founded in 1992 by the late Samuel Mockbee, a white Mississippi native, Rural Studio is a design-build program that, as part of its educational experience, immerses students in the design and construction of innovative, low-cost buildings for the immediate community. And there's Mockbee. And while their objectives share many similarities, Fatih, for his part, seemed to revel in the role of the architect, while Mockbee regularly demonstrated scorn for the profession's entrenchment and bent towards theory. He described American architects as, quote, house pets for the rich, and was known to regularly quip, screw theory, whenever he was privy to a conversation that ventured into conceptual territory. But what Mockbee was really denouncing were the discursive and exegetic traditions of the profession. While Mockbee was not the prolific writer that Fatih was, he was, in fact, more of an artist. He did manifest a pretty robust and recognizable theoretical domain of his own through a constellation of interviews, syllabi, and the off-the-cuff lectures and discussions he was known for with students and community members in New Bern. And I quote him here, "Everyone, rich or poor, deserves a shelter for the soul," end quote, he said, evincing what is clearly an articulation of a universal humanistic idea of dignity. Eschewing ambition or careerism, he noted that compassion is even more eventful than passion, another clear indictment of what he perceived to be the architecture profession's ambivalence towards socially driven architecture. He manifested this philosophy with a sort of kit of parts of vernacular assemblage, drawing inspiration from, quote, overhanging galvanized roofs, rusting metal trailers, dog trot forms, and porches. The term citizen architect, which implies a kind of inextricability between design and civic duty, was also a term credited to Mockbee and remains the proud moniker of the students who passed through Rural Studio. Since Mockbee's death in 2001, Rural Studio has been directed by the English architect Andrew Freer. So in February, I visited Freer in over 20 Rural Studio projects in Alabama. Freer is the only living architect I have studied for this project, and this visit afforded me the opportunity to ask the architect directly about what role dignity plays in his practice and teaching. Freer told me that while dignity plays a central role in the studio in his teaching, as it did for Mockbee, his understanding of the term is neither academic nor fixed. Freer has had to address certain criticisms of the studio that Mockbee did not in its early years. Foremost among them is the exploitation of power relations inherent in gift-giving, and for as one critic has called it, quote, making elitist architectural and middle-class values rather than the process of political emancipation and self-determination as a way to improve the lives of the poor, end quote. Another are the racial dynamics of a predominantly white core of students building for near exclusively black clients. It is to these critiques that Freer deploys his intuitive idea of dignity, as he calls it. Dignity, as opposed to academic. Dignity, he believes, is not afforded by a process that places a primacy on recycling and cutting costs, per se. He seeks to train his students from the outset to work with manageable off-the-shelf products, to be sure, but without obsessing over their cost, because doing so likens valuing people to likening the value of building materials. So it's a repertoire of common craftsmanship, he says, not a mechanism for cutting cost. So sublimating the tacit economics of the studio is, as such, a means to focus on what Freer believes is the true measure of dignity, a refined and unique spatial creation that lifts the client's spirit and empowers them to live with self-respect and a sense of ownership and dominion. Freer goes on to tell me something that taps directly into the academic prong in many theories of dignity without actually knowing it. So he thinks he's not being academic, but he actually is. That is that a key affordance of dignity is privacy, and this is one of the crucibles of academic theory on dignity is privacy. One construction site I visited, the Choice House, which was still being finished when I was there, which is a home for men in transition out of homelessness, is evocative of the studio's commitment to privacy. Although it could have been cheaper and easier to build shared apartment units for the structure's 6 residents, the studio itself built 4 micro-units, each with their own kitchenette and bathroom, the clients gaining privacy in exchange for what could have been roomier, albeit shared space. So Freer tells me that he also sees maintenance as a measure of dignity. He acknowledges the fact that student builders are not specialist contractors and that some work that is done needs remediation only a few years later. In addition to new builds, a major component of the studio's work is doing such maintenance work on a growing list of structures, some now as old as 30. This is the very reason, ostensibly, that Rural Studio does not build beyond a 20-mile radius. So to date, Rural Studio has executed over 100 houses and civic projects across the adjacent counties to New Bern. Under Freer, they have also become more focused on prototypes, such as this one called the 20K House, 3 different iterations of it, which is self-explanatory. It costs $20,000. Because of the lack of conventional credit for people with their level of income in the area, mobile homes are the main path to home ownership. Unlike a house, which is an asset for its owner, mobile homes depreciate over time and are linked with a number of health issues, including from the formaldehyde that's used in construction. The 20K house, with its different spatial permutations, is intended to model a home that could be reproduced at scale and with a measure of customization, and hence position itself as a viable alternative to the mobile home. So since 2005, there have been 16 iterations of the house, none of which have yet to reach a scale justifying mass production. So this statistic hints at my own conflicted response to my time in Alabama. So on the one hand, I was so incredibly heartened by the profound commitment of the studio's team, particularly the wide-eyed students, who with their devotion to social justice, long hours, and uncompensated labor, and genuine connection to their community and clients, constitute a completely inspirational model of what dignity can drive when it becomes a kind of sacred aspirational objective. But on the other hand, I was also left feeling disconsolate at the abject condition of some of the older projects I had long admired from photographs taken shortly after their completion for glossy publications. And so here's an example. And this is the glass chapel in a tiny little hamlet called Mason's Bend, a facility built in 2000 as a transportation stop, community gathering space, chapel for the local choral group, and a distribution center for children's summer school meals. The glass chapel was built with car windows salvaged from a scrapyard and placed atop rammed earth. In situ, we see numerous windshields have gone missing, the rammed earth has eroded and been carved into, and the structure has been completely enveloped by weeds. In nearby Greensboro, I visited a house where, although difficult to see in this photograph, the flooring was falling out. And neither the studio had the time to fix it, and the resident didn't have the money to fix it. So the reasons for failure in the homes are due to the lack of resources to maintain them, and maintenance issues are far more common when you have amateur student builders who aren't construction professionals. But yet there was also punctuation points in my tour of genuine beauty and achievement, as in 2 different boys and girls clubs in Akron and Greensboro, Alabama, respectively. Okay, so by way of conclusion, I would like to invoke Aristotle, who said, "Dignity does not consist in possessing honors, but in the consciousness that we deserve them." Rilke and Kahneman asserted this worthiness of dignity through their role in building and articulating a utopian community centered on primordial instincts like wonder and curiosity, not on the acquisition of capital or urbanization of the workforce. Fati, Machby, and Freer assert the worthiness of dignity through their role in articulating the moral obligations of supporting the indigent in both word and deed, even if both of their own particular experiments are imperfect. and partial failures. So what do these places and many others I will explore as I write this book tell us about the nature of architectural dignity? So I actually don't know how to answer that question. I'm sorry. I know that's why you're all here, but we can talk about it. But I do know this. No matter how we must modify our lives, buildings and cities for the future, human dignity must remain a primary goal of architecture. Dignity in living and the resources it requires are not at odds with a just climate future and fewer resources in habitable parts of the earth. History is pregnant with the potential to point to ways in which governments, if they are indeed committed to human dignity, as so many constitutions say they are, must themselves incentivize the growth of renewable systems and regulation. Neoliberalism, largely understood as hostile to human dignity, has long tried to convince individuals that the climate crisis is a matter connected to their consumer choices. This obfuscatory strategy is no longer tenable. Individuals must insist on having what they deserve, dignity, and governments and industries must in turn figure out how to manifest dignity for all citizens in a way that also fundamentally addresses a growing population in a world with dwindling resources. Thank you. So I will take questions now. Is that how it goes?
Yes, if you want to.
I'm happy.
Want to put the lights on.
No, I very much want to take questions. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk.
My pleasure.
I'm not sure if it's a question as much as a comment
Sure.
reaction. When you asked me at the beginning, not me, but all of us,
Yeah.
to imagine
Yeah.
what dignity looks like, I imagined a small house that was freestanding,
Mm-hmm.
and immediately the word stability came to mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I just sort of feeding off of your talk, especially at the end of the movements.
Yeah.
I feel like the question of time is part of dignity in the way that you're expressing
Yeah.
architecture, and that like part of how I'm imagining dignity as you're describing it, and all the definitions you gave me are totally opposite of this, so it doesn't work. But the material you gave me is really about that snapshot that it looks sustainable,
Mm-hmm.
and that no one is on the verge of a crisis,
Mm-hmm.
and that there is some sort of like continuity or perceived kind of sustainability
Mhm.
almost to someone's stability.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'd like to hear maybe if you have any comments about time
Yeah.
and how like you think of architecture and dignity in time.
In time. That's a great question. It's funny because I've actually at dinner parties run this exercise of like, imagine what does dignity look like in your head? And I'm being slightly provocative here today to say we're all going to imagine a house, right? Because in fact what some people imagine is actually people working, right? And sort of having the right to work or raising children or being happy, right? But often the house comes into the imagination. And so you raise an important question there about what is the time aspect of this. One person said to me, I'm picturing a kind of slightly patinated house, but it's not so patinated that it looks like it's about to fall, that the kind of lived-in-ness is actually what confers dignity in the same way that often sort of brand new buildings feel really clinical and sort of undignified in a way. So I think you're on to something there, that there's a durational aspect to this, but also, I mean, clearly what I'm pointing out with the rural studio examples, and none of these projects are older than 25 years that I've showed you, that can quickly kind of elude you if it's not maintained. So maintenance is to be, and there's actually a growing body of scholarship on maintenance in architectural theory and history, so it's not actually a coincidence that I think these things are coming together in my mind. But that maintenance is also crucial, and that maintenance probably speaks to some degree to this durational aspect that you're talking about. And this is also, I mean, Anna Maria will remember this, we took a class on ruins, that at what point does a building transition to a ruin, right? I mean, there's a kind of ambiguity. I mean, these buildings almost felt like ruins to me, right? So, once it becomes a ruin, it's no longer sort of even architecture, and then it's just a kind of visual phenomenon. And so I will think more about this, but it's a great point about the kind of durational aspect of this, and maintenance in particular. Yeah, come on.
So
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, there's a very robust body of literature for human rights, legal theory, development discourses that deal with the fact that the UDHR was de facto in its creation, from the moment of its creation, was sort of split into these sort of civil and political liberties, and then the economic, social, and cultural rights, which mirrored the sort of Cold War politics and tensions.
Yeah.
And the economic, social, and cultural rights, which are the material part of your argument, are the ones that have been systematically devalued, sort of marginalized for decades and decades, right? And as you know, there's a huge body of literature from the global south with critiques of human rights itself, more as being very, paternalistic, and also being opposed by theories derived from Western Europe and North America. And so dignity is interesting because it has come up in the last few years as a sort of like potential alternative to framing, the UDHR. But it's interesting to me because these internal contradictions, which are presented in each of these projects, so no matter what the architect might aspire to do or whatever the philosophical underpinning of that project would be, it still has to exist within a much larger material reality. And just on Tuesday, as I was lecturing on Brasilia, we were sort of thinking back to the first Siam Congress. The first principle, even though Siam sets out, almost 100 years ago, to address the spiritual, the human, all of these sort of like needs of human beings, the first principle is about architecture and economy. And so essentially, in some ways, subjugating architecture in the service of economy. And building the state very much like the UDHR does. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is there has been such robust discussion about these internal contradictions within these frameworks. So how do you, coming at it from both architectural history and perhaps philosophy, how do you think it's possible to use a new term, or a term that's been around in different ways, to address those internal contradictions?
I really appreciate that because, one of everything you've said is correct and something that I've already been grappling with. And when you do a kind of first, as one does, a first kind of search in Hollis about, what books have the word dignity on them, it's almost all development theory. Development with dignity, dignity in the working place, in the global south, et cetera, et cetera. So it is really interesting to me that it was economics and political science, so the social sciences, that took up the UDHR sort of primacy of dignity first, and that the humanities actually just kind of ignored it for 40 years. Philosophy and architecture kind of ignored it. It wasn't actually a kind of trope in design studios or in philosophy, for that matter. So it's kind of, that in itself is an opportunity, right, to kind of actually say, well, let's actually not approach this as an economic and the economic argument subtends architecture all the time, right? And none of us want to live in a world where architecture is subtended to economics, I hope, right? So maybe by revisiting it from this humanistic and architectural angle, we have new opportunities. That's what I'm trying to find out. But what you're also revealing, and this is what I'm finding through these case studies, is that those same contradictions of sort of hegemony, even in a case like Fatih, where the architect is Egyptian, are there, right? And that there's a kind of assertion of a kind of top-down strategic form of power that is not the kind of grassroots, tactical architectural strategies that we all sort of want to see. So I don't know. I'm sort of in a Gordian knot here where I don't know what the way out is, but I'm trying to at least approach the knot from a different angle, right, which is the humanistic angle. Yeah.
So just for Fatih, I think, and I'm sure you're familiar with Mena Azar's work on the
Yeah. 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 Thank you, Larry.
First, I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay.
No,
Nice to see you.
The two, and one of the comments and one of the questions, and maybe the question is painful, but the conversation was good. But the first comment was to maybe expand on my experience with dignity, and it really fits in with what you're talking about. When I went to Haiti, I think it was 2012, right after you were 6 months after you were
Yeah.
with another professor here, Phil Thompson. And as we were driving from the airport to our hotel, it was on the top of a very steep hill. It was one building, a tall seven-story building that had been toppled over concrete. And there were people walking out on the sidewalk, and there was a woman on the sidewalk with a bucket of water, bathing herself, completely exposed on the sidewalk. And I just was and there were people everywhere.
Yeah.
And Phil turned to me and said, that's a person who has lost her dignity. This person feels so much less like a human.
Yeah.
They're okay with washing themselves in front of a group of people.
Yeah.
And so you see that in the backdrop where it's just destroyed.
Yeah.
So it kind of fits in a little bit with your narrative in terms of just an observation.
Yeah. Well, particularly with respect to privacy.
Respect to privacy.
Yeah.
So it expands on that in my mind.
Yeah.
But then the question for me is more what you just started to allude to in your conclusion about neoliberalism, the individual, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, because that's a really tough conversation, but it's really fascinating when you think about neoliberalism, housing, the idea of helping other people. It's a contradiction unto itself.
Well, yeah. I mean, the kind of, I've really started to work seriously on ecological issues, and but I also travel a lot for my work. And what people who want to criticize me say is like, well, that's not so ecological to fly everywhere, is it? And I hear that, but I also think that is part of the sort of problem, is that we've reduced responsibility to the consumer, to us as monadic individuals, to say, is your carbon footprint as low as mine? When in fact, we could be actually investing more money in electric airplanes and renewable resources and all sorts of things that could get us there faster, which none of us can do on our own. That's a regulatory problem. So I think that the argument here is that neoliberalism sort of forces us all to think of us as individuals. And what I want to walk back is that this is a societal, this has to be viewed as a societal concern. And so is Rural Studio doing this for individuals, or are they doing it for society? That's where you can kind of run up into some debate. But that's where I stand on this at this point, that I don't think any of us should continue to apologize for, whether we remember to recycle a can or something. That it's far more important to put pressure on people who have actual power to make these changes. So that's the best answer I have for now, Larry.
I wasn't even looking for an answer. I was hoping
Yeah.
to expand upon it. I would push you further. The expansion of that is you were saying how individuals that have the ability to work, like neoliberalism is all about giving power to a few individuals.
Yeah.
A lot of power.
Yeah.
And those people who don't make choices.
Those kinds of choices. Yeah. Yeah.
There's no answer to it.
Yeah.
It's more just
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah. Thank you. Hi. Please.
So I'm from Denmark, and we've been doing a lot of research on public housing in Denmark. So not social housing, but public housing. And this is housing going up in the 20th century Danish welfare state.
Yeah.
So we looked at the concept of welfare.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, dignity in Danish, it's værdighed, so
Yeah.
that has to
Which
do
is
with værdi, which
and
means
Voda from German. Yeah.
and also dignity is closely related etymologically to the concept of worth. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering if it was interesting for you to maybe go through some of the iterations we've been doing
Yeah.
with the little bit like the kind of societal model in the US, where welfare has to do with giving to people who are considered living below a certain
threshold,
and who are worthy of being given
yeah.
some kind of help. Then with the Danish welfare state being consolidated, in particular in the post-Second World War period, this was another model. It's called the universal model of welfare. Of course, universal here meaning national.
Yeah.
Every citizen of Denmark is in an equal relationship to the state and both contributes to and receives welfare constantly throughout life, cradle to grave. And it's really only the Scandinavian countries that have this. And then we have seen in recent years a kind of slippage back to a notion of welfare not as well-being or this universal concept of creating the good life for every citizen in the state, but moving back to this question of wealth, where in the way neoliberalism functions in the Danish context, public housing, for example, suddenly becomes an investment opportunity. Or the beautiful landscapes of these public housing estates are now being places where stuff is built, so the material itself, the bricks or concrete of these buildings now become a place to accumulate wealth, and no longer a vehicle for creating the good life.
Yeah.
So I was thinking maybe those kind of slippages were interesting for you, because now in light of this idea of, there's a new aesthetic on its way to describe our new relationship with sustainable architecture and stuff, I was just wondering whether an interesting question to ask would be not so much what it looks like, the kind of architecture we're after, but rather what it can do. What kind of mediator can it be between humans and the material context, both the built and the natural?
Yeah, I mean, this is fantastic. And, anyone who studies sort of political systems knows that Scandinavia is sort of at the front of these things for some of the reasons you're describing, which is the philosophy of welfare. And, I'm privy to the fact that even there it's eroding, as it sort of seems to be everywhere. I hope you can tell that I don't actually really care what it looks like. This is why I have such sort of heterogeneous projects. It's not about a kind of visual style, if you will. I don't think that actually dignity is even consonant with the notion of style. But I think maybe what we can learn from the welfare state, which is something I've thought about, is that, we've been talking in this talk about how, and Larry's example of seeing someone who's sort of been reduced to utter indignity, that is one way to measure dignity, is like, does someone have it? Are they able to kind of manifest it? But also, every time that we don't provide for someone, we lose our dignity, right? Or if we hurt someone or take away their dignity, we're also losing our own dignity. So that if the state takes on that as a moral precept, that is where actually welfare begins to actually work, because the state sees it as a stain on their own identity if they have, and I wish this country would do that, if so many people live in abject poverty when you have wealth to distribute. And I'm not a socialist, I promise, but that there's aspects of that which are manifest here. So yeah, I mean, I guess the best answer I can offer you is that I think that welfare offers us a kind of idea of a reciprocal dignity, that having a kind of neighbor who is living in indignity is also an indignity to us. Nasser.
How can you not be a socialist after this talk and after the kind of thoughts that you are sharing with us? So I'm going to use all the questions that you have received to perhaps reorient your answers a little bit.
Okay.
You said we don't want architecture to be subvented to economics, but we actually want economics to be subvented to architecture.
Yeah.
Or don't we?
Well, I said I don't want to live in a world where architecture is subvented to economics.
But do you want to live in a world where economics is subvented to architecture?
That would be preferable, yes.
So you're a socialist. But actually, the elephant in the room, the word that you haven't used, or maybe you've used it, but only in passing, is politics, because this is really what Uma started her question about, because that split in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights between what is called the economic rights and what is called sort of like the personal rights was expressed immediately in the 1940s and 1950s, and is split in two ideologies that are ruling in this country, in the world. And one of them is no longer there, and it's not being brought into the discussion. And my question is coming actually from the promises of communism to you about dignity and how it relates to, you can call it socialism, you can call it communism. Is dignity, in your view, absolute or is it relative? And how does it relate to the different individuals in society? And depending on your answer, what's the relationship between dignity and equality in a society? And that perhaps actually take me to her question, again to the politics that we're talking about. Clearly, Denmark was actually moving more in the socialist direction when all the citizens were the beneficiary and the recipient and the contributors to the welfare state. I mean, forget about the Soviet Union and forget about what the Soviet Union did to its citizens or to its colonies, but that principle was at work, and it clearly is washing off on what is called the
welfare
Scandinavian welfare state. So really my question to you is to relate what you are saying to the politics of socialism, not to say communism, and how dignity relates, theoretically if you want.
So this is where maybe I need to. I mean, I spend so much time thinking about architecture that I might actually benefit from spending more time rereading Marx. Well, to answer a few of your questions nested, and then I'll try to get to the bigger one. So, absolute or relative? I believe it's a relative, that dignity is a relative term. I mean, it would be very imperious for me to stand up here as a white man in Massachusetts and say, this is exactly the problem of the UDHR and of development theory, to say what dignity in Angola should look like, right? I can hint at ways to approach it or ways that you might think about it, but it has to be relative. It has to be relative to the cultural circumscription of a place. I think you can talk about things like air, food, water in absolute terms because they're critical to survival, but that there's also, as I've indicated, with work and happiness and thriving, however that's defined, things that are culturally inscribed. So it has to be relative. So that's one point. So that also then kind of segues into the question of equality. I think this is where you might get into some of my thinking on socialism. To some degree, the way I've understood and sort of embraced dignity theory is that there is a column or a kind of crucible in dignity theory that one has the right to pursue their own interests and to pursue their own path. And if that means becoming a rich entrepreneur, I actually think that that's your right. I don't think what you manifest materially from that speaks to your dignity, but the fact that you can pursue that, if that's your interest, is actually also some measure of dignity. So I don't know if, like a universal basic income is sort of the solution to dignity. I think that, or it might be, but it's not the entire solution, right? I think dignity can't be conflated with equality, but it has to be conflated with some, or equated with some measure of justice and fairness and reciprocity and greater good, right? This is why I was talking about the problem of neoliberalism and monadism, of us all becoming sort of Darwinian individuals, and this is where, the Scandinavian welfare state is perhaps the closest we've had to that sweet spot, if you will. We know that the Soviet Union didn't deliver on it. We know that the welfare model is sort of losing it right now, but that there may be, in moments like those, certain sweet spots that are instructive. So, I'm probably then a social democrat, if you will, like a liberal social democrat, if you want to politicize it. But I also think to some degree, given everything we're inundated with right now, that some reprieve from something that is super explicitly political is also important. That we need to kind of take this to a philosophical plane for it to get a little bit of mileage in a moment of great divisiveness. So that's why I think I've taken the tack that I have.
You know that philosophical statements are absolute. The only thing that is relative is politics, really. And that takes me back to the model of that welfare state, because what really distinguishes it from the model that you are presenting in here is that equality is an equality in receiving, but also in giving. And therefore the equality is produced not in all receiving the same necessarily, but in receiving differently, but also giving differently. So your entrepreneur in the society that you're talking about is not just collecting.
Well, that's why I said reciprocity.
So you actually, again, I mean, that model is what socialism is at the end of the day. Because you are accepting the differences between individuals, and therefore you're relativizing the role of the central authority in supporting them, but you're also relativizing the role of the central authority in making them pay for the welfare of everyone.
Yeah.
I wanted to slightly push back on some of this conversation about human beings and I used to live in Copenhagen, with respect to my Danish colleagues. I think we often forget that Sweden is a huge country.
Yeah.
Forget that Denmark colonized Iceland and continues to colonize Finland.
And Norway.
We forget Norway as well, maybe more wealth to be said. So the wealth that is being redistributed to their model is actually premised on deep inequality and extraction without those particular states. And so every time in this country, when we have someone like Bernie Sanders talk about the standard model, I'm like, I think we need to contextualize where that wealth comes from in the first place and continues to come from.
Yeah.
So, and what enables that to
Yeah.
exist. So that's just my
Do
little...
you mind if I just add a little bit to that? Because that was one of my comments, was also that maybe it didn't come through so clearly, but it's also very nationalist. So a concept, it's called universal, but it's actually a nationalist, and it's also very African-centric.
Yeah.
So apart from being capitalist, and colonialist. So I completely agree on that. So it was more about these interlinkages between the welfare and worth, welfare and wealth, which I think are also present in the word dignity.
Yeah. Well, at least in the Germanic languages, it's etymologically rooted in worth.
Yeah.
And same in German.
Which is value over time.
That's true. That's.
And on that note...
Any other questions?
For Shade. Yeah. Yeah.
Architectural cases. That was I can see how these 3D projects will speak to that concept that they mentioned. I was wondering if there's a particular reason you have 3 cases or how you manage it. I was just curious to know if you wanted to add more projects.
Yeah. No, I definitely do. I'm presenting the ones today that I have been able to visit and do work on so far. I also, it's obviously global in scope because we have 3 very different places, and that's, part of the ambition for a 4th book is to maybe hit that level of breadth and horizontality, and I, as many of you know, I'm a card-carrying, pro-global architectural history person, but I also fully recognize the limitations of. These are all places that I tried to spend some time in, but the limitations of, my epistemic limitations to, know exactly what's going on. But I don't, and this is conversations that we've had in things like GAHTC, the compromises you might make on being able to fully get something are overshadowed by the benefit of really trying to make this as relatable as possible to a kind of global condition, and the benefits that that has to our thinking. So that's the kind of compromise I'm making here. And I will probably stand by it until the global is completely knocked off its pedestal and whatever comes next is put on instead. But no, sir.
In continuing with the topic of what projects you're going to be looking at, I would urge you to look at projects. Some of them actually have been recognized in the last 6 or 7 cycles of the Aga Khan Awards, where the architect is taking very seriously the issue of economics and who is paying for the project, especially when it is a welfare project, and looking for alternative ways of funding and fundraising than to depend on the central authority, whether it is a World Bank type of thing or a state, and looking for other ways of maintaining the dignity of the recipients, not to think that they are the recipient of some sort of
charity,
donation or welfare coming from outside or elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, and I think
a few suggestions.
No, and I'll take them. I mean, I think to some degree this is what, when I mentioned the autodidacticism of Fatih and New Gurna, how that was, meant as a tool to try to buy into that kind of sort of autonomous investment. But as I explained, it didn't work. But I don't believe that. I've heard of these kind of self-build projects that happened in Chile, for example, in the post-war period, where actually, there was quite a lot of sort of owner pride in their house, and they did watch after it and maintain it, right? So it's not a lost cause to involve the client and to have them build their own home, but it obviously doesn't work all the time either. Larry.
One last comment.
Yeah.
I just can't stop thinking about this. Is one of your cases, the Fatih case. That case is so front-loaded with so many issues that are discussed before you even get to thinking.
Yeah.
So let's say, for example, a client was like, I wonder what that model of dignity would look like, because you're really relating it to a group of white people and white students.
Yeah.
Something for black.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder, like, if the discussion is about dignity for the black recipients, or is it dignity for the white people who are doing this?
Yeah.
And what is their motivation?
This is
one of the big issues that we talk about a lot with white identity. Is
yeah.
the idea of being a good person is the first value. Individual achievement as another value, and all of those things are front-loaded before you get to the idea of doing something related to dignity or elevating.
Yeah. I totally appreciate these comments. And for those of you who don't know, actually, Larry and I have a kind of history on this topic because I worked on a show at MoMA in 2008, right, 15 years ago, where Larry built a house, his shotgun house for post-Katrina. So we've already had this conversation 15 years ago. But I'm trying to dial it back again. But I think so I told you that Andrew Freer, the guy leading the studio now, does not, he's like, I don't care what, philosophy has to say about dignity. This is what I think it is, and it's about my intuition. And it's a bit like that famous Supreme Court case of, so when they said, I know pornography when I see it, he's like, I know dignity when I see it. You have to rely on his intuition. That's already the problem one, right? It's his intuition that's dictating it. But also, I was like, well, maybe, I was thinking in my head, maybe you should read philosophy, because if you had a kind of better academic understanding of dignity, you would start to actually understand that dignity is it's a kind of two-way, it's a coaxial relationship, right? That if you want to help someone out, that's great, but you also do run the risk of compromising your dignity and their dignity if you if you sort of insult them with your gift, right? So, and this is what one of the critics I quoted has basically said. So I think that they aren't critical enough of what they're doing. And, but as I said, I'm also there on the ground with these students, and they just want to do good. And you don't want to like disillusion them by, sort of telling them to go home and just focus on their white neighbors, right? So what is the solution exactly? I don't know. I mean, this is a kind of like, again, it's the Gordian knot. And there's certainly an element of it. Yeah, and then when you drive by someone's house where the floor is falling out, and I think, well, and they don't have enough time to fix it, and the owner doesn't have enough money to fix it, then you're stuck in your own sort of white built hell, right? Of like a kind of dysfunctional house built by a bunch of 19-year-olds. So.
And a lot of the treatment that's happening is on the premise of promising this dignified life, like public housing projects.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that you run a project, can you insert dignity at any point in the sense that like the government, it doesn't seem like the government has any intention of like promising some kind of dignified life to these people, and like Hassan Satz took it upon himself.
Yeah.
However, his premise, the way I understood it in your discussion, is that these people currently are not in a dignified state. So I think in a way there is kind of this power imbalance about I need to give them this dignity, and I think that's part of their. I find trouble with that, and what I guess my question is: can anyone offer dignity to somebody else, or is that something that's like you never from yourself?
Oh wow. That's a beautiful and deeply philosophical question. So I think I've understood different strains of the philosophy around it. That some people believe that dignity can always be autonomously manifest, even without any resources. That's about 20% of the literature. 80% will say that it requires some measure of outside help. So that's why this is framed really as a threshold condition, because if we could all manifest our own dignity even when we are penniless and unclothed, then this wouldn't be a problem, right? But since there's a consensus that it requires some material and financial investment, it necessitates sort of ascertaining A, what is the threshold, and B, how is it realized socially. But what I do think, to try to answer at least part of your question, is, can anyone offer dignity? I think we all can offer dignity whenever we, no matter how much resources we give out, whenever we offer to help someone, right? I mean, that's a form of sort of confirming our own dignity and helping raise the dignity of someone else. And help can be, not necessarily financial. It can be, help a friend move, or help, your parents when they get old and sick, or whatever it may be. So that's the best I can offer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you.